I'm Mary Lyons, the Wealth Woman.
And I'm Eric Alexander with Acorn Grove.
Welcome to the Wealth and Income Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about Social Security. This is one of those things we get lots of questions about.
Yeah.
There's certainly some myths surrounding it. And I think even understanding how did it come about, what's the history, all that context is helpful to understand what it is, what it's supposed to do, and where some of the risks are. And Eric has been kind enough here to do a ton of research leading up to this particular episode. So I'm gonna hand this over. I'm gonna take a backseat role today, if you can believe it. And Eric, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah. Well, do you want to start with the challenges or where it came from? Where do you want to start this thread?
Let's start at the very beginning.
It's a very good place to start. So it's actually fascinating because it's a concept that started actually in Germany back in kind of the 1880s, 1890s, and that side of it from Otto von Bismarck, for those of you way back in history. And it was an interesting idea as he was coming in. And Social Security for the German, when they put that in for the Germans, didn't actually get started until when you were roughly 70 years old. And a lot of it was there for kind of solving two problems that the Germans had. One was they had a portion of the population, just like every population, that was sort of sick. They couldn't work. They couldn't do some of the major things that they needed to do to keep producing money. And so they wanted to have sort of a backup plan for those people. But the other part of that is, if you look at life expectancy at that time, you had a lot of people that were in the German economy that were still alive longer than they thought they were going to be. And frankly, they were still working and doing jobs, and they were not as productive. And they had sort of a larger growing population of young people that were trying to come in that didn't have jobs. They didn't have a place to go. And so they started creating the system to kind of help those people out of the workforce so that they could have room for the new people coming in. And I thought that was kind of an interesting sort of start to the process.
Yeah, it's as you have people kind of hitting an age where potentially there's some cognitive decline, or if there's physical labor that their bodies cannot do as productively as when they were younger. And then you have new people who maybe have no experience and are looking for jobs. There is a loyalty, especially if someone has worked for a really, really long time, right? And I want to be like really sensitive too for our older listeners. If you're having pushback when I say things like cognitive decline, I apologize, right? It's not everybody, but there's definitely a portion of the older population that starts to see different cognitive function as they get older. And so you think about even something that we experience here in America, there's a real thing. Ageism is a thing, right? Where there's the sort of idea that newer ideas need to come in, or, that as technologies change, all that sort of stuff, that new workforce can come in and kind of revitalize things. But I think that the motives of kind of the introduction of this were really more altruistic, just
for sure.
Read and understood, which is, if you have a portion of the population that has lived beyond life expectancy and they're continuing to work because they have no other choice, then there is no easy way to help them enjoy the time that they have left if they're forced to do potentially really difficult work in order to continue to support themselves. So I think this is about, if you've lived longer than you expected, providing resources so that you can actually have a retirement.
Yeah, well, and it was funny in doing some of that research, he got some bad press for setting that up. He was 74 at the time, so he said it even before he was even eligible. So like he was way beyond that period, but he got labeled as a socialist when he first started talking about that. And he's like, look, I get it. This is not how we came up. This is not what we normally do, but what else are we going to do with these people? Like how else should we manage that? Yeah. And the other kind of part that I thought was fascinating is the original age was set at around 70, but in the kind of the mid 1915, 1916 era, so almost 30 years after it got put in force, they actually lowered the rate, lower the age that you could start getting it to about 65, which is where when the US was looking at doing that, that's where they got a lot of their, I don't know, what are other people doing? And that's kind of where they came up with that number.
And I think, even if you're looking at a program like this and you have that leaning where you're like, oh, that feels socialist. The fact of the matter is that in the American culture, we don't like to see old people or disabled people with no resources.
Right.
And I think we are very altruistic as a society because we don't like to see people suffering, especially when they are people who either can't control their own destiny, or people who have been like really productive contributing members to society that now it's our turn to take care of them. And so I think we, like always, I like to stay away from some of the political aspects of the conversation because it's easy to look at it and say this is wrong or this is right, depending on
Right.
your beliefs. But I think understanding the facts and the evolution are really important so that we have some context for what could happen in the future.
Yeah, and where it might be heading. And that was kind of the interesting part is the Germans were kind of the front runners for that idea, for the front runners for the kind of concept of an old age fund or a social security fund. And it didn't really take hold in the US until kind of the 20s and late 20s, early 30s. And our own social security came into force in 1935. So it was a number, 30, 40 years after the Germans had did it before we started pushing it. The interesting part in some of that research is when you look at life expectancy, especially for the US at that time, life expectancy in the mid 30s was only 60 years old, almost 61
Mhm.
when they put that in force. And so if you think about the system they created with a benefit that you don't get until 65, is they're not expecting that many people to actually take part. They're
Right.
expecting half of the population to already be kind of gone at that point.
So if we just kind of fast forward to where life expectancy is today, life expectancy today is about 80 years old, give or take a little.
Right.
And so that would mean that if we were adhering to that same philosophy, if we were waiting until 5 years after life expectancy, nobody would actually receive Social Security until age 85.
Right. Yeah, but as Social Security has, or as life expectancy has moved up, the Social Security number has not changed with it. It's stayed right where it is.
Right. And so right now it's 66 years and 7 months. Is that
Right.
right? It's
Yeah,
66
for full.
years roughly to hit full Social Security age.
Yeah. Well, and the other interesting thing I thought that we came across when we were looking at it is in 1935, when it first got put in force, there were 45 workers actually producing for every one beneficiary. And so you
Say
had
that
a
again.
Yeah, so there were 45 workers to every one beneficiary when it first got started.
So
Uh,
there's 45 people contributing in to the Social Security Fund for every one person who was receiving benefits when the program started.
yeah, and
What is it today?
that's the fun part. Right now, it's 3 to 1,
Whew.
and in the next decade, it's expected to drop to about 2 to 1. And so there's a fair amount of weight, kind of on the shoulders of the workers today to
Mhm.
carry that load, which
Mhm.
is it's daunting, right? And that's kind of been the challenge over the last couple of decades of, man, what do we do with this?
Right. Well, I'm not sure if this is the right time to introduce this into the conversation, but as we started talking about having a podcast around this, I did what a lot of people do, I think, when you're trying to get
Right.
information. I got my phone out and I typed into Google Social Security facts, right? So
Right.
it was interesting because if I kind of scrolled through to, okay, I'm looking for something that hopefully won't be like too biased one way or the other politically,
Right.
that I could maybe pull some data from. One of the things that came up pretty immediately was an article from AARP. And again, you could argue where that falls politically, probably. You could do that with any publication. But I thought the very first myth that showed up in an article where they were kind of going on about 10 different myths about Social Security
Right.
was this idea that Social Security is underfunded. And so if I think about even just the information that you just gave us, Eric, if it used to be 45 people funding it for every one person that was receiving benefits, and now we're at 3 to 1 and we're going to go to 2 to 1. I think there's some other information that we want to talk about here, even including, birth rates and how this trend is changing over time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and there's and there's a couple of components on there that I think are fascinating. And so for most developed countries, what they would call replacement rate, so for how many people are born and die in a given year, the replacement rate is usually around 2 to 1. So two people being born for every one person passing away, and that's usually what they will call replacement rate. And I didn't look up the numbers for the European economy, but for the US right now, the current birth rate's right around 1.7, almost 1.8. And so it makes sense when you look at the data that we are currently below replacement rate. And so if I'm looking at a 3 to 1 ratio projected to go to 2 to 1, then that lines up fairly well. That we have a shrinking number of people working versus a number of people coming out, because we're really hitting our stride in the baby boomers of that many people hitting 65 and coming through that stage of life.
So, Eric, I'm going to ask a question just so you can kind of expound on this, because I think that probably some people listening are going, wait, if for every one person alive today, 2 people are being born, how is that replacement rate, right? And when we look at 1 to 1.7, if we're making the assumption that everybody is living through childhood into, working and full life expectancy, can you talk just a little bit about that data?
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to infant mortality rates, and that's kind of a large portion that drives that 2 to 1 ratio. And so if you look at developed nations with very high or very low infant mortality rates, the birth to death ratio of 2 to 1 kind of plays out. If you look at less developed nations with higher infant mortality rates, the replacement rate needs to be 3 to 1 or higher. And a lot of it has to do with not just who shows up on the planet, but who shows up on the planet and is still alive all the way into the workforce, and and even beyond into their kind of mid to late 60s, right? And being able to make it through. And so for Western industrialized nations, more developed nations, where we've kind of figured out infant mortality as best we can, or we've got a better track record on it. We don't need 3 or 4 or 5 kids being born for every one person that passes away.
It's more surviving through childhood into
Correct.
work.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we put a little color around that, because otherwise it would be really easy to reject the data.
Right. Because you get 2 new people for every one that dies. It's like, well, we've got a population problem really quickly, very, very fast, right? But yeah, and I think that's the challenge is what some have called sort of an inverted pyramid, where you've got a lot of people being paid out benefits for a shrinking people working to provide the benefits, if that makes sense.
Right. So can we talk a little bit about that myth that showed up on AARP? I'd actually like to just read through some of what they talk about so that we can comment on some of it. And I'm just making sure I've got the right thing up here, guys. But here's myth number 1. This is the very first thing that showed up in that article about myths about Social Security. And that myth is Social Security is going broke. So that is the title for the section, according to this article. And right underneath it, it says the facts. As long as workers and employers pay payroll taxes, Social Security will not run out of money. It's a pay-as-you-go system, meaning revenue coming in from FICA, the Federal Insurance Contributions Act, and from SECA, the Self-Employed Contributions Act, taxes largely cover the benefits going out. Social Security does face funding challenges. Again, I'm reading directly from this article. For decades, it collected more than it paid out, building a surplus that stood at $2.83 trillion at the end of 2022. But the system is starting to pay out more than it takes in, largely because the retiree population is growing faster than the working population and living longer.
Right.
Without changes in how Social Security is financed, the surplus is projected to run out in 2034, according to the latest annual report from the program's trustees. So this is not a politicized type of result here that we're talking about. This is from the trustees.
Right.
Even then, Social Security won't be broke. It will still collect tax revenue and pay benefits, but it will only bring in enough to pay 80% of the scheduled benefits, according to the latest estimate. To avoid that outcome, Congress would need to take steps to shore up Social Security's finances, as it did in 1983, the last time the program nearly depleted its reserves. The steps then included raising the full retirement age and increasing the payroll tax rate and introducing an income tax on the benefits. So those things are important because as we get to why is this relevant to you, which I think if you're listening to this podcast is probably because you're concerned about retirement in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
We're going to talk about how we plan, right? And how we want people to be thinking about some of these aspects.
Right. And I think it seems inflammatory to say this, but it's not meant to be. But one of the concepts we keep talking about is functionally, Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. You take money from the people that are putting in and you give it to the other people going out. And it's not a bad thing. It's how it was designed since the beginning. And when you have 45 people putting into one worker, the Ponzi scheme works.
Math works.
The math works. And so I know Ponzi scheme is not a fun, and it's not meant to be inflammatory. I'm not bomb throwing, but that's kind of how Ponzi schemes works. And so if you think about what she said in the article, the list, and then I'll shut up, Mary, is as long as workers and employers pay taxes, it won't run out of money. It's a pay-as-you-go system.
Right. So here's where I think you get to say that Social Security works a little bit differently, is that if somebody was actually running a Ponzi scheme, I mean, I guess they could maybe increase what they were charging people to put in, except that it's all voluntary in a normal Ponzi scheme. Here, in order to keep things afloat, the government has carte blanche, right, to either change the benefits or, as we just talked about, change the taxes to make sure that everything can continue. So what I really take away from the data points that we have just gone through is that we have another adjustment that will be coming down the pipeline.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
That is, and this is always where I go with this. Whenever I start collecting data points, my brain goes to, why does this matter to me? And why do I need to know it? What is it? What can I change about what I'm doing in order to make sure that I'm taking the relevant parts of this? And so I think for me, every time I hear this conversation, Social Security is going to run out in 2034. It doesn't mean that the benefits are going to run out in 2034. It means that there is a date at which point in time the benefits will have to change, or how we are putting into the system will have to change. So we know, I think we say this fairly often. I don't know how often it's actually on the podcast, but the only thing that is certain in life, right? It's taxes, death, and change. We know that all three of those things are going to happen.
Right. And Social Security impacts all three of those. It's lovely.
Right.
When are you going to die, and how much your tax is going to be, and how much is this going to change? Well, and I think that's it, right? And again, I wasn't trying to bomb that with the Ponzi, but it's kind of how some of those work, right? But I think we talked about this earlier.
I try and soften it, and then you're just dropping bombs. It's okay.
It's okay, right? And that's why we balance each other out. It's lovely. But I think that's it, right? And we've talked a little bit about this in a number of other podcasts, but when we think through how we used to do retirement planning, we had investment accounts, we had the market that we were working with, we had pension systems when pensions were a major factor for retirement planning, and we had Social Security. And two of those three, Social Security and pensions, were really based on what we would call distribution engines. And as pensions have largely gone away over time, the last sort of bastion of distribution engines really was and still is Social Security. And so when I think about if that changes, or if it gets impacted, or taxes are bigger on it, or however that looks like that change comes, it puts more and more pressure on the individual and the family to go manage their own distribution systems. And to me, that's one of the big now what kind of moments for me.
Right. So Eric, you, as we were kind of prepping for some of this, one of the things that you talked about was the number of families who are largely reliant on Social Security for income. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and some of the articles, and this came from a Forbes article, is about half of the current retirees count on Social Security for half of their income. So it's for a number of retirees, this is at least half of their income coming in. So if it changes, that could be a big deal. But without Social Security, there's about 20 million families that would actually move below the poverty line. And that's another big thing I think that comes out on the other end. And to Mary's point, we are a nation that looks at the disadvantaged, and we want to go do something about it. We don't want mass starvation and homelessness in the streets and roll grandma off a cliff because she's not useful anymore. Like that's not how we function as a society. And so if that goes away, all the way goes away, that's 20 million families that are suffering in a big
Right.
way.
So I want to talk a little bit about how Social Security could change in the future.
Yep.
And then I want to tie it back into the point that you just made, Eric, about really building efficient income strategies and being able to plan as if it's not there so that every penny you get is extra. But I think really making sure that we understand some of the changes, and that AARP article really mentioned several of them right off the bat.
Yeah.
If we're looking at, okay, we know that either across the board benefits have to be reduced by 80%, right? That's the shortfall. If continuing to tax people the way it's being taxed, although I think they don't really like to call it that, but if you continue to do things the way we're doing it, and the shortfall is that only provides 80% of the benefits, then what do? Reduce the benefits by 80%. And then people who were promised that they were going to have more than that,
Right.
that are reliant on that in order to survive, have a major issue. So
Right.
I would make the assumption, just based on how things have happened in the past, that Congress is not going to come in and cut the benefits of people who are currently receiving them.
Carte blanche, just you're done.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not where I would think that would go. But if you look at what happened, I think in 1984, but don't quote me on that, that's when Social Security benefits became taxable at a certain income level. So
Right.
prior to 1984, all of your Social Security income in retirement was tax-free. But then in 1984, when they were dealing with some of these shortfalls, one of the ways they dealt with it is by making your Social Security payout taxable if you
Right.
earn income outside of it. And so that is a precedent that I think has to be talked about, because especially when you look at the way we're taxed today, our normal tax system, not thinking about Social Security, increases the more you make. And so introducing that into now your benefits are taxable definitely changes the picture for people who have higher incomes.
Well, and it's politically easier to do, right? I mean, I think the third rail of politics is messing with social security, right? And then a really like third rail way to go do that is everybody's down by 20%, suck it up. Like that doesn't go well. But I think a much easier political pill to swallow on the other end of it is just what you talked about. Like, well, if you earn X amount, if you earn too much, whatever that number is, then we'll just tax it. And for those that are in the bottom end of the taxable income range, for you guys, we're leaving it alone. And I think that's a fairly simple, whether I like that or not, that's a fairly simple way to go do that.
Right. Well, and I think too, we don't have any real control over what those taxable rates are.
Right.
So, I think there's an issue there. I think the other thing that they could look at doing is, and I think there's precedent for this too, is they could take the cap off of contributions. So I think, and again, I actually didn't look this up. I'm just trying to go from memory here as we're doing this. I think
Right.
the contribution limit is 168,000 this year
Yeah, that
on
sounds right.
Social Security. And so up to 168,000 of your income, you're going to make contributions to Social Security. But for dollars you earn above that, you're actually not making contributions at all. And when you look at what happened with Medicare contributions, I don't remember how long ago, years ago at this
Yeah.
point, they took the cap off. And so now you pay Medicare contributions on all of your income, regardless of how much you're earning. So it would also be, I think, because there's that precedent, very easy for one of the suggestions to be that we just take the cap off.
Right. And now every dollar you earn from 0 to $1 million and beyond is all taxable.
Right. That would
Yeah.
be a fairly easy way with precedent to raise more funds to
Right.
make up some of the shortfall.
Yeah, and if you look at the precedent, the other precedent I think from the 80s was raising the rate or raising the age. And so, you know, it went from 65 to whatever it is now, 66 and 7 months. And so I think you could, I think another fairly easy combo strategy would be to raise the age a little bit. Make it 67, make it 68, make it 70, whatever that rate needs to be, so that it's at least more commensurate with actual life expectancy and what we're seeing.
Right. I think all of those things are very, very possible, and there's
Yeah.
no telling which of them will actually happen. But I think the
Or
reason that,
combo.
right. I think the reason that this becomes so important is if you cannot just open up your social security statement or log in online to ssa.gov and be like, this is what I'm getting with certainty, then you really have to shore that up by making
Right.
sure that the dollars you are saving are very efficiently creating income for you. And I would say that usually, unless someone is within 5 to 10 years of full retirement age for Social Security, a lot of times when we're building out the strategy, we want to see how can we be as efficient as possible without that, and then we'll add in here's expected Social Security. And I can say that for a lot of our younger clients, when we ask them, do you want us to include potential Social Security income? The answer is usually no.
Yeah, it's fascinating how often it's no. It's better than 70%. It's like, nah, I'm not getting it. Which is sort of a very fatalist view of it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but I'm like, it's probably not wrong, but it's very fatalistic for you to be that jaded at such an early age. But okay, fine. It's a better way to plan.
If you can get to your preferred lifestyle income
Right.
without it, more money, great. You can always find something to do with more money. So I
Right.
think that's actually a good way to do planning. But
Yeah,
you're
for
right.
sure.
It is say how many people are just kind of flippantly say, I don't expect to get it. Okay, so let's talk for just a second, Eric, about creating efficient income, because I think this is what it boils down to. And I think sometimes you and I may use slightly different language around what we're doing, but I think that this is the perfect time to talk about the difference between just chasing rate of return and hoping for a big net worth, and efficiently and deliberately creating higher income streams than you could do something, maybe doing it the conventional way.
Yeah, and it goes to what you call a lot of times the easy button, and what I call sort of the core system of how do I make sure that we're maximizing income and not just net worth. And I think it's in our DNA to go after, because it's kind of how we grew up, to go after rate of return, rate of return, rate of return. And I think a large part of that is how advisors get managed and how we get judged on whether we're doing a good job. Is I gave you my money, what's the net rate of return, what's my net worth, and how are we doing? But very rarely does that directly correlate to how much income am I going to get. And there are 100 podcasts in our past that we talk about this number. So I'll let you go look at the how we got to the number, but the accepted sort of distribution rate, if you just have a big pot of cash in the market, is about 3%. So every $1 million you've accumulated only gives you about 30K in income, and nobody's excited about that number.
Right. Well, and I'm just going to prep this out too. I think in our last podcast, we talked about this, and I'm just going to tease it again. We're getting ready to do a deep dive, long form podcast that will go in great detail through safe distribution rates and strategy changes in order to get better and more efficient income. But I'm going to high level this because
Yeah,
I do
please.
think that, and again, this goes not necessarily to manage money or a traditional investment portfolio, but I want to just bring home the concept. I remember having a conversation with a gentleman that had a $10 million real estate portfolio that he owned free and clear. And he told me he couldn't retire. And I thought to myself, how are you in a position with $10 million that you can't retire?
Right.
And then I looked at the math and it made perfect sense. So this gentleman had almost all vacant commercial lots that were not producing any revenue. But in Texas, the tax rate on investment properties can be anywhere from 2.5 to 2.7 or even 2.8%.
Right.
And so he had vacant lots in one apartment complex. The apartment complex was throwing off probably close to $300,000 of positive cash flow after expenses. But
Right.
all of that money, minus about $25,000, was paying the property taxes on all the vacant lots. So
Right.
here someone worked so hard to build a $10 million net worth, and it was producing $25,000 of income. If they did not have the vacant lots at all, they could have been spending about
300
$300,000.
grand. Yeah.
So what happens is when we think only about net worth, sometimes we make decisions that look really great on paper and we feel proud of ourselves,
Right.
but they have a negative impact on how much income we can spend and enjoy each year.
Right.
Versus if we were trying to get to the 300 of income, we really could have shortcutted that whole process and retired much, much sooner if that was the only thing that we actually did. So you could sit there and argue, oh, well, he could sell all those vacant lots, but then it comes time to, is it the right time to sell them? What are you going to get for them? Is the market right? And so the point is, if you have that kind of money and you had just been doing all apartment complexes, which I'm not saying you should do because there's no diversification there, but if you did all apartment complexes, the income level would have been substantially higher than doing where you're just looking at net worth and capital appreciation. So that shift to income is so incredibly important. And I just want to make sure that we really underline that point, and especially as a teaser for the long form. So you can go back and find income strategies in our podcast history. There are tons of podcasts on that, but the deep dive is going to be soup to nuts, start to finish. The history, the situation, here's how you hit the easy button, and then here's how you accelerate through that into income strategies. But I want to leave you with that because it always comes back to, okay, but what do I do about this?
Right. Yeah. Because otherwise it's just fatalistic and we're just done. Like, well, what's the point? Forget it. Right. But I think it's also change and chaos in these moments are actually really good because it helps us refocus on the point. And the point of everything we're doing and everything we save is so that we have more income when we're ready to be done than expenses, and more income than birthdays. And if we kind of and that was the beautiful thing about social, is that it focused on the exact right thing for everyone that had it, was I want income more than birthdays and more than expenses. And it may not have covered all the expensive, but it was the right focus. And I think the blessing that we are coming to as it gets shaky is people start going, wait. If I lose that, I'm losing X dollars in income. That's a big deal. How do I recreate that? And how do I do that efficiently? Because that a third of what they were doing is just overnight's gone. Or it could be like in a catastrophic dystopian future, it's gone all at once. It wouldn't be, but I'm throwing bombs, so there's another one in the tank there. But I think these times of chaos and change and uncertainty are actually really positive because it helps us refocus on what's important.
Yeah, it's where you find the creativity. So I want to make sure we leave you guys with this. We have solutions for how you can take the same resources that you already have. You don't have to work harder. You don't have to save more. You don't have to chase rates of return. We can just introduce efficiencies and you can get further with less. And that, I think, is the key. So if you're going, oh man, I hadn't thought about these things, now I'm freaked out, keep listening, stay tuned in, and we will keep giving you solutions. Absolutely. Eric, where can we find you if they're looking for you.
Yeah, they can find me at Economics with Eric wherever you use social media. What about you?
At The Wealth Woman.
Thanks. You guys have a great day.
Specific financial concepts and advanced strategies are presented to you for educational purposes only. We cannot and do not guarantee their applicability to your individual circumstance. We encourage you to seek personalized advice from qualified professionals on all financial matters.
Provided content is for overview and is not intended and should not be relied upon as individualized tax, legal, fiduciary, or investment advice. Neither Wealth Woman, Acorn Grove, or the Wealth and Income Podcast, nor their representatives provide tax or legal advice. For answers to specific questions and before making any decision, please consult a qualified attorney or tax advisors.
All numeric examples and any individual shown are hypothetical and were used for explanatory purposes only. Actual results may vary.
Investing involves risk, which includes potential loss of principal. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Guarantees are subject to the claims paying ability of the issuing insurance company.
Life insurance should be purchased by individuals that have a need to provide a death benefit to protect others with insurable interests in their lives against financial loss. Life insurance is not a retirement plan, investment, or savings account.
Not affiliated with or endorsed by the Social Security Administration, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or any governmental agency. Insurance and investment products, not a deposit, not FDIC or NCUA insured, not insured by any federal government agency, not guaranteed by any bank or credit union, may lose value.
Please visit the Wealth Woman website disclosure page for other important disclosures.